The crack of the slap echoed through the police precinct like a gunshot. For a split second, the entire room froze. The shuffle of boots, the clatter of phones, even the hum of chatter died instantly. A white officer stood there, his hands still raised, his face twisted in arrogance. Before him, a tall black man stood steady, his cheek stinging but his composure unshaken. The officer smirked, puffing his chest out as though he had just reminded someone of their place. The room was filled with cadets, veteran officers, and clerks. All eyes darted from the officer's sneer to the black man's calm, unreadable face. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time had been shackled by the weight of what had just happened. The officer laughed under his breath, muttering loud enough for all to hear, "That's what happens when you don't know respect." But before anyone could react, the black man's lips parted. His voice was steady, powerful, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Respect," he said slowly, his eyes locking onto the man who had struck him. "You'll learn about respect very soon." "Because I am your new chief!" gasps erupted from the room. A paper cup fell to the ground, coffee spilling across the tiled floor. A young recruit's jaw dropped open and even the most seasoned officers stiffened in disbelief. The arrogant smirk melted from the white officer's face, leaving only shock and horror. His knees seemed to weaken as he realized the man he had just humiliated wasn't an ordinary visitor, wasn't some random citizen he could dismiss. He was the man now in charge of every badge in that room. The tension was electric. The other officers shifted uneasily, knowing the ground beneath them had just shifted forever. Whispers spread like wildfire, a mix of fear, shame, and astonishment. The man who had been underestimated, disrespected, and slapped in front of everyone had just revealed himself as the most powerful figure in their ranks. But the black man didn't raise his voice, nor did he retaliate. Instead, his calm presence alone was enough to make the guilty officer break into a cold sweat. The room had transformed in an instant, from arrogance and cruelty to stunned silence, where every officer now realized they were standing at the beginning of a new era. This was not just about a slap. It was about respect, justice, and a reckoning long overdue. And the man who had just been struck down was now the one who would decide the future of everyone in that room. The silence after the revelation was deafening. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loudly. The white officer who had slapped the black man a moment earlier stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if words had abandoned him. His face, once filled with smug superiority, now drained of color. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and fear. Around him, officers shifted nervously, eyes darting between their stunned colleague and the man who had just revealed himself as their new chief. For years, the precinct had been an echo chamber of arrogance and unchecked authority. It was the kind of place where respect was demanded, not earned, where those with darker skin were treated as outsiders, even when they wore the same uniform. The slap hadn't surprised most of them. Such acts of casual cruelty were not unusual here. What stunned them was that the man on the receiving end of the humiliation wasn't just another target. He was now the one with the power to rewrite the rules of their world. The black man stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink into every corner of the room. His steady gaze moved slowly across the faces of those present, some ashamed, some shocked, others trying desperately to mask their fear. He wasn't just scanning them, he was measuring them, weighing the culture he was about to inherit. The officer who had struck him tried to recover. He took a step back, stammering, "Chief, I didn't know." But the words sounded hollow, pitiful, stripped of the bravado he had flaunted just seconds earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered them to his sides, aware that every eye in the room was watching him unravel. The new chief didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his back to the man and began walking across the room, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the tile. Each step carried authority, and each second of silence twisted the knife of shame deeper into the guilty officer's heart. Finally, the chief stopped in the center of the room where the precinct flag hung limply in the corner. He faced the entire room now, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "This department," he began, his tone deliberate. Has a reputation. I've heard it whispered in the streets. I've read it in complaints filed by citizens who no longer believe in justice. And today, he paused, his eyes flicking briefly back to the officer who had slapped him. I've seen it firsthand. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling across the room. No one dared speak. The guilty officer shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could disappear into the floor. The chief continued, "Leadership is not about fear. It is not about intimidation. And it is certainly not about humiliating the very people we swore to protect, or each other. Leadership is about respect, discipline, and honor." His voice grew firmer now, the calm giving way to controlled fire. And if anyone in this room believes otherwise, their days in this uniform are numbered. A murmur spread among the younger recruits, some stealing nervous glances at their seniors. For the first time, many of them felt the possibility of change. For years, they had been told to keep quiet, to follow the old ways, to let the culture of cruelty and arrogance continue unchecked. But now, standing before them, was a man unafraid to challenge it all. The officer who had slapped him finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with desperation. "Chief, I didn't mean any harm." But the chief's eyes cut to him like a blade, silencing him instantly. "You meant exactly what you did," he said evenly. "You believed your badge gave you power over others. You believed your skin gave you authority to demean, and you thought no one would ever hold you accountable." The words struck harder than any slap. The officer's head dropped, his arrogance dissolving under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, the rest of the room braced themselves. This wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the entire culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. They all knew it. They all felt it. Some of them, silently, even feared what would come next. The chief took a deep breath, his voice steady but resolute. "From this moment on, this precinct will change. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today, every officer will be held accountable. Every action will reflect the values we claim to uphold. And if you cannot accept that, then you don't belong here." The tension thickened as the chief's words hung heavy in the air. For some, they carried hope. For others, they carried dread. And for the guilty officer, they carried the crushing realization that his career, his pride, his very future was dangling by a thread. The room seemed to pulse with unease. Officers exchanged quick, nervous glances, silently asking each other what this new era would mean. Would their secrets come to light? Would the injustices they had buried finally be unearthed? And if so, how many of them would survive the reckoning? The chief didn't wait for answers. He turned sharply toward his office, signaling that the meeting was over. But before stepping inside, he glanced once more at the officer who had struck him. "We'll be having a very different conversation soon," he said quietly, almost like a promise. And with that, he disappeared into his office, leaving the room trembling with fear, awe, and the unmistakable sense that nothing in this precinct would ever be the same again. The precinct buzzed uneasily in the days that followed. Whispers filled the hallways like smoke seeping through cracks. Rumors about investigations, warnings about new rules, and speculation about who would be the first to fall. The slap that had once been dismissed as an act of dominance had now become the fuse for something larger, something no one could stop. At the center of it all stood the guilty officer. His arrogance had drained away, leaving behind a man hollowed out by fear. Every time a door opened unexpectedly, his heart jumped. Every time the chief walked past him without a word, his stomach twisted. The silence was worse than any punishment. It was the waiting, the knowing that something inevitable was coming. Then it happened. On a crisp morning, the officers gathered in the main hall for what they assumed was a routine briefing. But as they shuffled into rows, they noticed something unusual. The chief stood at the front, his expression calm, but flanked by two men in sharp suits. Their presence sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. "Federal investigators," the chief's voice carried across the hall, steady and firm. "This department claims to serve justice," he began, "but justice cannot exist where corruption thrives. For too long, behavior that dishonors the badge has gone unchecked. That ends now." The guilty officer swallowed hard, sweat breaking across his brow. He tried to stand tall, but his body betrayed him, trembling as though it already knew what was coming. The chief stepped aside, allowing the men in suits to take the floor. One of them spoke with precision, reading from a thick folder. "We have received multiple complaints regarding misconduct in this precinct. Use of excessive force, discrimination, abuse of power, and in one case, a direct assault on your own commanding officer." Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned. Eyes fell on the guilty officer, who looked as though the ground might give way beneath him. His face flushed red, then drained pale as every accusation bore down like a hammer. "This behavior," the agent continued, "is not only unacceptable, it is criminal. And it will be prosecuted as such." The guilty officer tried to speak, his voice cracking. This is a mistake. I didn't know who he was." The chief's voice cut through the chaos, calm but thunderous. "You thought your ignorance excused your violence. You thought the rank of the man you struck was the issue. No, the problem was your arrogance, your prejudice, your belief that you could demean and harm without consequence. And today, that ends." The room was tense, officers watching with wide eyes as the suits stepped forward. The guilty officer stumbled backward, panic flooding his face. "Wait, please, you can't—" His words dissolved into incoherent pleas as the agents clasped his wrists in handcuffs. The metallic snap echoed across the hall. For the first time, the arrogant man's power was stripped away, replaced with cold steel biting into his skin. He looked small now, fragile, nothing like the towering figure who had once strutted through the halls with unchecked confidence. The chief stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about you. This is about every officer who thinks the badge makes them untouchable. From this day forward, know this. Justice will come for anyone who forgets what this uniform stands for." The officer's knees buckled slightly, his voice breaking as he begged. But no one came to his defense. Not one officer spoke up. Those who had once laughed at his cruelty, who had turned a blind eye to his arrogance, now looked away, unwilling to share in his downfall. As the agents led him out, the silence in the hall was heavy, suffocating. Some officers stared at the floor in shame, others fixed their eyes on the chief with a new kind of respect. They all knew the message had been sent, loudly, unmistakably, but the climax wasn't just the arrest, it was the reckoning. The chief turned back to the room, his voice steady, but burning with conviction. "Do you see what happens when power is abused? When arrogance replaces duty? The community we serve deserves better. They deserve protection, not fear. They deserve justice, not corruption. And if anyone here believes they cannot live by those principles, walk out now. This precinct will not shield you anymore." No one moved. The weight of his words pressed on every chest. Some felt pride, others dread, but all understood the truth. The old order had crumbled. The guilty officer's pleas echoed faintly down the hallway as he was taken away. The man who had once slapped a fellow human in arrogance, believing no one would stop him, was now reduced to nothing more than another criminal awaiting justice. And in that moment, the Black Chief stood taller than ever, not because he had punished a man, but because he had shown an entire department that the era of impunity was over. The climax had arrived, and its echo would shake the foundations of that precinct forever. The echo of the officer's handcuffs hadn't faded when a quiet stillness spread across the precinct. It was as though the walls themselves were listening, absorbing the moment. The officers who remained stood rigid, their eyes heavy with unspoken questions. Some shifted uncomfortably, as if ashamed by their own silence in the past. Others clenched their jaws, wrestling with pride or defiance. But no one dared to break the silence. The chief let it linger. He wanted them to sit with it, to feel the gravity of what had just unfolded. For too long, men like the one just taken away had poisoned the culture of the badge. This wasn't only about one slap. It was about years of unchecked arrogance, years of whispered complaints ignored, years of fear among the very people sworn to protect. Finally, the chief spoke. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a steady weight. "You all witnessed what happened today. Remember it. Let it remind you that this badge is not a shield for your ego. It is a promise. A promise to protect, to serve, and to stand accountable." He let his eyes sweep across the room. Some officers nodded, others looked down. A few, still clinging to the old ways, crossed their arms in quiet defiance. But the chief wasn't interested in forcing allegiance. He knew true change would take time. What mattered was that the seeds had been planted. Later that day, news of the arrest spread like wildfire beyond the precinct walls. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Headlines blared across every local channel. Officer arrested after assaulting new chief. The story was no longer contained. It had become a symbol. For the community, it was vindication. Too many had suffered in silence, their voices drowned by the authority of uniforms. Now they saw justice in action, and hope stirred in places it had long been absent. Mothers told their children, "See, things can change." Elders whispered prayers of gratitude, their weary hearts lightened by the possibility of fairness. But the impact reached deeper than public headlines. Inside the department, conversations began to shift. Officers who had once turned a blind eye now reconsidered their choices. Younger recruits, who had silently feared becoming like the corrupt veterans around them, now saw an alternative path, one where integrity wasn't weakness, but strength. The chief made sure of it. He introduced new training sessions, mandatory reviews of conduct, and open-door policies where community members could bring their concerns directly. It wasn't perfect, resistance remained, but the system was moving, grinding slowly toward something better. As weeks turned into months, the fallen officer's trial began. Each day, more evidence surfaced, reports of misconduct, complaints ignored, abuses buried under paperwork. The slap that had once been brushed aside now shone as the catalyst that dragged all the hidden rot into the light. When the guilty verdict was finally read, the chief didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or revel in victory. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, exhaled, and whispered to himself, "One step forward." For him, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving power. It was about restoring what had been broken, the trust between the badge and the people, the honor of the uniform, the humanity behind authority. The climax had been the officer's downfall, but the resolution, the true impact, was the slow, deliberate rebuilding of faith. It was the moment a child could look at an officer and feel safe again. It was the moment a citizen could file a complaint and believe it would be heard. It was the moment a precinct once drowning in corruption could begin to breathe. One evening, months later, the chief stood outside the precinct doors, watching the sun set over the city. He saw families walking the streets, children laughing, people moving with a little less fear. It wasn't perfect, justice rarely is, but it was progress. A young recruit stepped outside, hesitating before speaking. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you for showing us it doesn't have to be the way it's always been." The chief gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "Don't thank me. Just carry it forward. That's how real change happens." And as the recruit walked away, the chief allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The slap that was meant to humiliate had instead ignited a fire. A fire that burned arrogance, lit courage, and reminded everyone that true authority comes not from fear, but from justice. That was the legacy he intended to leave.